Myth number 1. The throwout bearing shouldn't be touching the clutch fingers. Wrong, and if you're referring to the McLeod instructions for their twin disc clutches, they're wrong too. It doesn't matter if you have a factory self-adjusting quadrant or not, the principle is the same. The throwout bearing is designed to be in constant contact with the clutch fingers. No free play. If you have an air gap, two things can happen. 1. The throwout bearing will scrape and squeal against the clutch fingers every time you shift, and 2. You waste precious clutch travel taking up the slop, which means the clutch probably isn't releasing fully, which damages your transmission's synchronizers. What McLeod is really asking for is an air gap with the cable disconnected, so there is room for the clutch fork to move back toward the transmission, because as the clutch wears, the clutch fingers move towards the transmission. If you have a manual firewall adjuster, then you need to pay attention to the clutch adjustment over time and loosen it with clutch wear. With the clutch cable hooked up to the fork, adjust the cable tension so all of the slack is out of the cable and it takes a few pounds of force to move the clutch half of an inch. And the clutch engages about a third or halfway up from the floor. If the clutch engages just off the floor, the cable is too loose. Notice with the clutch cable adjusted properly, there isn't any slop between the bearing and the clutch. Myth number 2. You need a different pivot ball stud. No, you don't. Here's the pivot ball stud. It's responsible for the geometry of the linkage. You want the clutch fork to be sliding across the release bearing as little as possible. The factory linkage does this well enough. You only need to change the length of the pivot ball if your clutch stack-up is significantly different than stock. If the clutch stack-up is more than stock, the fork could hit the transmission front cover and not have enough gap to accommodate the clutch wear we talked about before. Or if your stack-up is shorter than stock, then a longer pivot ball stud brings the geometry back into spec. But for 99.9% of clutches out there, the factory pivot ball stud is just fine. Changing it will just create other problems. If you really think you need a different pivot ball stud, measure the finger height of the factory clutch and compare it to your new clutch. Set your pivot ball height to match the difference.